The Daily Signal's news producer, Tim Kennedy, joins us now. Tim, you are on the other side of the mic this time. Thanks for being willing to be in studio. You wear a lot of hats here at the Daily Signal, so thanks for coming into studio to talk on the mic. Appreciate it.
Someone's got to do it. Thank you so much, Virginia, for having me.
Well, you were just down in Asheville, North Carolina, about a week or so after Hurricane Helene. That whole area was just devastated. I think it's helpful to begin this conversation by talking about why this area was hit so hard. Obviously, this was a massive hurricane, but there were some factors that really made Asheville really vulnerable to the amount of rain. Just kind of explain what those were.
Yeah, so to start off with, Asheville itself and the surrounding communities are essentially a valley. It's very mountainous. There's the fabled Blue Ridge Mountains going all throughout. And at the center, or in the dip of that valley, you have the French Broad River. And traditionally, obviously, Asheville can be susceptible during wintertime to blizzards and some power outages from that, but never from like heavy flooding like the flooding we saw over a week ago, starting on September 27th, when Hurricane Helene just ravaged through the community, essentially, and overflowed the French Broad River, and with it, any and all communities that came along it, from Greenville in South Carolina, all the way up through Asheville, all the way up north to Boone, North Carolina, and so forth, even into parts of southern Virginia as well.
Wow. Was the scene on the ground what you thought it was going to be?
So I had covered the Lahaina wildfires for the Daily Signal a little over a year ago in Maui. And there you went in, and it was a very like pinpoint area where there was just total devastation, destruction. Everything was burned down to essentially the foundation. And going into it, I kind of had that background and experience in my head where I expected to see some trees ravaged. I'm, from New Jersey originally. I grew up there during Hurricane Sandy. So I'm familiar to like the scenery of sort of like maybe boats like, torn away from their mooring and whatnot, and some trees knocked down. But I was absolutely blown away just about the amount and the height and the width and the radius of the destruction, again, coming off of that French Broad River. Just imagine just like, it's almost like you're watching Jurassic Park, where they go and they try to like hunt down like a T-Rex, and they like look in the forest, and there's this whole just like swath of trees that are like knocked down. Jeez. So just like imagine that, and it being like, a football field in width, going like for miles and miles and miles of just like trees knocked down, houses ripped from their foundation and just like thrown completely down the river, boats again and cars just like flung about. So it's just very, I guess, concentrated in that sense. But the river obviously runs throughout Asheville, Hendersonville, Henderson County, and like the surrounding low-lying areas as well.
So it touches and affects all of it. Did you talk to anyone that lost their home?
Yes, I talked to a couple people. I took a day trip out to Lake Lure, which is about 48 minutes southeast of Asheville. And there was one lady, she was a local restaurateur who had opened up her doors to feed, needy and hungry residents, National Guardsmen, volunteers. And when I caught up with her, she had told me that she had to be helicopter evac'd from her home, which was in and around, I believe, Chimney Rock, which is one of the hardest hit communities close to Lake Lure. And I asked her if she had been back to her home ever since. She said no. So she was essentially just like had to like leave with like the clothing on her back and a backpack. And she had been living out of her restaurant, which she was also volunteering at and running as a relief center for about a week at that time. I caught up with other residents who were going to her restaurant who had their like, there was one group, an older gentleman and his wife, whose home they just saw just like go in a landslide essentially. Jeez. So yeah, no, there are like homes like completely destroyed for sure.
You met a really sweet woman, Diane Messer. You posted a video of her on your X account. It's just a sweet woman, sweet conversation. And she lives kind of in a small community and some interesting situations, even a woman in her community who went into labor the night of the hurricane. Pretty wild story there. But what did she have to tell you?
So pretty much when I arrived in Asheville, I had, I had very baseline understanding. I was very ignorant of the geography. And so I started out my trek at a Waffle House, which is
as any good Southerner would.
It's where it's a well of ideas. And
Yes.
so it's the town watering hole in a sense. And so I went and I was chatting up this one gentleman who lived in a mobile home community in Hendersonville. So this town is about 30 minutes south of Asheville. And he was telling me about how one of his neighbor's houses essentially was cut in half by an oak tree that fell during the hurricane. So, and they were without power, and they were going into their 10th day without power, without running water. And so I was like, well, I got to go check this place out, because obviously, when we turn on the news and we hear what the mainstream media is telling us, they're telling us all about the River Arts District in downtown Asheville, but they're not really getting into the nitty gritty of the outlying communities,
More rural areas, yeah.
in and around Asheville, which were the hardest hit by the hurricane. When you go look at the death tolls and those who are actually perishing from it, there are from what you might coin as the sticks, so to say, the areas in and around Asheville itself that were hardest hit, those living down by the river itself. So I went to this mobile home community, and it was Big Oak Park. Again, they were without power for 10 days. It's a 55 plus community, a lot of individuals at risk. Overall, low socioeconomic class, but just I pulled up like at, 8 a.m. on a Saturday, and this nice lady, again, Diane Messer, just comes out of her home and greets me, and it's very friendly. And she just takes me on a whole tour of the community. She walks me through her whole process from the start of the hurricane on September 27th till then, what it was like being visited by FEMA officials, who's come to help them out, and just like the whole story from there. And, in her bringing me around the community, I was, introduced to other individuals who live there. And again, very similar story, very at risk. People who are at least, in their 60s, maybe even 70s, living alone. A lot of them, again, Big Oak Park, as the name entails, they have a lot of big oak trees. And so during the storm, a lot of them fell down on their homes, but it also blocked all the roads in and out of this community.
Okay.
So I had residents telling me that they couldn't even leave their homes to go out for supplies for 5 days.
Wow.
And that's 5 days without power, some of them without running water. So just a very, difficult time. And in her recanting her whole experience throughout, then I asked her, what were the most difficult parts of it? And she said it was the lack of communication with the outside world. There was initially a lot of misinformation given to this community. And this community consists of about 40 mobile homes, but that's just homes. There's obviously families that live in those homes. Yeah. And, they were told once by local authorities, don't call 911. And then at some point it was, you can call 911, but only for, if you're if you're in an emergency at that moment. So a lot of sort of miscommunication. I had a gentleman, his name was Alexander. He took me on the back of their golf cart, essentially, drove me around the community and also brought me around town. He's a manager at a local Papa John's there, who's serving, meals to all the, relief workers and volunteers. Wow. And he was just like, going from home to home saying, this person, she's 86. She lives there. A tree fell in her house. This family gave birth, or the wife went into labor during the storm because of all the stress. And so that's what Diane Messer was referring to as their miracle out of all this, that this little girl was born. Unfortunately, she's born into a home that will probably be condemned because the tree fell on it. Jeez. So, and, a lot of these residents felt very, the miscommunication was one part, but they felt incredibly, betrayed is probably too strong of a word to use. Yeah. But they felt, kind of passed over or left out, because they began to, again, this is a community of 40 mobile homes. Throughout the 10 days from the storm to when I visited, a lot of the communities around them were receiving power, were having their lines repaired. And they had stories of, utility workers and FEMA representatives coming to them midweek, working for a couple days and then just leaving. And
Okay.
they were confused if they would ever get back online. Nobody was reaching out to them if they needed any support, any help. And so they thought that they were just forgotten, that someone just like looked over, like someone just, like the world just forgot about them. And so luckily though, I just received a text today from Alexander who lives there, and he told me that they are finally getting power back now.
Wow.
But that's, 12, 11 days since then.
Later.
So that's
My gosh.
insanity in itself. And really it's the neighborly and local response that's the best response, because, there wasn't the local officials, state officials, federal officials, they didn't come to dig them out. They had to essentially bring out chainsaws and cut their way out. And so it was, very heartwarming to hear about, but it's sad that it had to come to that.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the response, if you would, what you saw about neighbors helping neighbors, people coming from outside the community to help.
I was overwhelmed. I mean, again, like I said, the local response was the best response. I went to local breweries that had shut down all their operations and had also converted their production from beer to bottled water and gallon jugs of water. This guy Alexander, who's the manager at the local Papa John's, he was just, working, 24 hours a day, feeding all of the volunteer workers. And the volunteer workers, they themselves were just people that worked at churches, people that own their own helicopters and were doing air drops and air evacs. And essentially, there was no mass coordinated effort. It was just people getting together, seeing something was wrong and pitching in on their own time within their own communities. There was no larger web. And again, there was no larger coordinated effort. So that was just like amazing to see that it's like these little hot spots of aid going on. That was.
Did you see any FEMA workers or any official representation from the federal government there?
So the only time I saw FEMA workers was when I went to Lake Lure. And this wasn't even at the lake itself, because when you get down close to the lake, that's where it was the local restaurateur had opened her doors to feeding, hungry mouths and whatnot. It was a little bit up the road. It was like at a strip mall. They had a RV that they had converted into a workstation, and they had tables out and people in, FEMA fatigues, essentially signing people up for disaster relief. This is the, $750 checks that we keep on hearing about. They're the ones who are helping them with their application process. To the best of my knowledge, obviously there was no like handing out of supplies. They were surrounded by locals that were handing out free coffee, handing out groceries, caring for one another, but they were just there to facilitate the, direct deposit of money and insurance and the whole 9 yards into people's bank accounts, which is important, but that was really the only time I saw FEMA. I saw a lot of more of like, I saw the North Carolina National Guard in Lake Lure doing some recovery effort there. I saw some North Carolina officials. There were utility workers, like where I stayed, and then everywhere around Hendersonville, every single, motel, all their parking lots were just filled with utility trucks from like all over America. I saw, New Hampshire, Missouri, Florida. They were just like a sea of utility trucks.
They've all responded.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it was pretty incredible to see. Most of any of all the energy companies were there, Duke Energy, the whole 9 yards, but also again, like people and private companies from, as far south as Florida and whatnot. So it's, just an incredible local response.
That's
for
powerful.
sure.
When you talk to the local people, did they feel pretty positive? Sort of like, this is better that we just have a local response? Are they frustrated with the federal government? Do they think the government's doing enough? Do they kind of just want them to stay out? What was the attitude among the locals?
It's split, I would say. For those not familiar, like myself, before this trip to the Asheville region, when you kind of delve into the socioeconomic and politics of it, you kind of have this bubble that's Asheville itself, which is a very, progressive, artsy community surrounded by, again, what, people colloquially might like coin the sticks. A lot of people calling themselves rednecks and calling their neighbors rednecks, which is just, normal down there, but as a couple of Northeasterners, which I'm sure we both are, it's very, you hear it as more of an insult, but they wear it like a badge of pride. So that was like fascinating to see. But so you have like two ends of the spectrum there, and no one in the middle.
Interesting.
But to answer your question though, about the perception of, federal aid and non-federal aid, there was this sort of, I hate to even call it a political divide, but there definitely was a worldview divide where those from the outlying communities were not necessarily, they welcomed federal aid, but they were very critical about the lack of it at first. And just how, again, like that RV I was discussing at a strip mall outside Lake Lure, I was talking to a gentleman serving, free coffee, and he had been serving it there since not this past Sunday, but 2 Sundays ago.
Wow.
So the first Sunday after the hurricane hit. So about 10 days for him. And he pointed at the FEMA truck and he's like, I've been here 10 days, but those jokers just arrived 4 days ago. So they're they're definitely keeping them on their toes. Granted, when I talk to people within Asheville itself, they are very much of the mind that they have a finite amount of resources, they being FEMA, and they're doing the best they can. But it's on us, the community, to step up and step in for one another. We can't rely on the government to solve all of our problems. To which I say, that's wonderful. Now let's have that opinion on every other government program in existence. If you could just take that mentality and spread it amongst everywhere else, that would be great. But
limited
alas,
government.
alas. So it was kind of it was a mixed review of people saying, being critical and also welcoming of FEMA.
Sure. What about when it came to kind of that FEMA conversation and talking to folks about their opinion? I know you asked people, what would your message be to the Biden administration? If you could talk to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, what would you say to them? What were some of the answers that you got back from people?
Yeah, and I asked people of all, not asking them who they would vote for in this upcoming election, but people of whom I was served, I assumed were of all political stripes. The question you just said, if you could talk to your highest elected officials, what would it say and why? And an overwhelming majority of people had the same answer, and it's that we need to start caring for Americans first. We can't look to the world and the needs of others before the needs of American citizens, putting that paramount above all else. A lot of people asking for more funding for FEMA, for more assistance there. So it was just a very, a lot of people referencing, illegal aliens and whatnot, and the whole fiasco there with FEMA. And I know that upon further research, people are saying, oh, well, there's 2 buckets of money. There's the federal disaster relief aid bucket, and then there's the housing and local communities bucket. I think at the end of the day, people aren't too concerned about the nuances of, separate fundings and the accounting there. They're more so just upset that why do we even have a second bucket in the first place? There should only be one bucket. It should be the American bucket. And so it was just, fascinating to hear, very, very palpable.
Yeah. The recovery is going to be long in North Carolina. In seeing it for yourself, the situation on the ground, what are we looking at timeline wise? I mean, will that community ever be the same?
I think I would ask residents that. And again, this nice gentleman, Alexander, the manager at the Papa John's, who took me on this whole lengthy ride along around Hendersonville, I asked him the same question. He's like, probably at least 6 months for the recovery. I actually asked the initial question of, everyone is in this sort of disaster relief mentality right now. It's not business as usual. Businesses are not open. People are not going to work. People don't have homes to go to. People are obviously volunteering their time, money, and capital to help one another, which is extremely heartwarming to see. But I asked, how long will this exist for? And he says at least a couple months. And then after that, probably, if I had to, what they maybe told me was a year. If I had to ballpark it myself, I would say a couple of years for sure. I think that the homes in and around the French Broad River, need to be totally rebuilt. Communities like Chimney Rock need to be totally rebuilt. There's just nothing to go off of. Everything's been, this foundation has been swept away. The town, if you've ever been to, Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii, for instance, that whole, after the volcano erupted, it completely transformed the topography and geography of the surrounding area in Naples. And that's essentially what has happened to this whole region, is that the actual physical geography of it is totally different from what it was 2 weeks prior.
Because you have roads that are just gone. Literally.
Just totally swept away. Part of I think it was the Blue Ridge Parkway, I think it's called, leading west of Asheville. Part of that was just swept away, and it's still closed. So very, a long road ahead,
certainly,
in their recovery.
Yeah. Well, Tim, you have put out so many great videos. You're continuing to put them out as far as what you saw. Awesome aerial footage, devastating aerial footage, but just awesome in the sense of getting that perspective of, okay, this is actually the situation on the ground. Tell us, how do we follow you on social media? How do we see all these videos? Yeah,
you can follow me at Tim Kennedy Jr. 1, and definitely be sure to keep checking out the Daily Signal.
Awesome. Well, the Daily Signal's news producer, Tim Kennedy. Tim, thank you for being willing to go down there. Thanks for your work on this. Appreciate all your reporting.
Thank you so much.